So anyway, I did what everybody does when they get to California, I think. I got into therapy. I have to hold my husband responsible for that. I met my husband, Lou, who's back there. I met him on a ship. I was going to live in Alexandria, Egypt. That was my dream. I had a year-old baby in a backpack on my back, and I got on a ship going to Egypt, and I ran into your man here. And it was my birthday. It was like a few days before my 30th birthday. And he said to me, "It's lucky we met now because I can't trust anybody over 30. Even though he was long over 30 himself. But he gave me an IOU, and one of the IOUs was for therapy, so go figure it out. He only knew me 4 days, and he was already offering to pay for therapy. So anyway, I came to California, and I got into therapy. Let's see. So let me tell you what happened when I got into therapy. Well, when I got into therapy, I realized that I really didn't hate my father. You know, I was really angry with him, and I worked through that. So I resolved to try and make up with him, and so I planned on going back to Ireland and seeing what I could do to kind of make things good between us. But before I did that, I started calling home and trying to talk to him on the phone, because when I'd call home, my mother, if he answered the phone, I'd get my mother on the phone right away. I never talked to him, you know. So I started calling home and talking to him on the phone, trying to get his story, trying to find out where his pain was coming from, what he was all about. So I pieced together his story with my mother's help, and I began reaching out to him in ways that he could accept. I started making more phone calls home. If he answered the phone, I would engage him in conversation instead of asking for my mother immediately. Sometimes our talk was just banter. Other times I would ask him little things about his life. Slowly, we began dipping into the well of love that we had shared when I was a little child. I resolved to go to Ireland to try and make my peace with him. I didn't want to read him a litany of complaints. It was more important just to heal the wounds and to be connected with him. I was nervous when I got to Ireland, and I didn't know if I could go ahead with the plan. As luck would have it, I got up early one morning to find him sitting in the armchair, studying the racing form, as per usual. My mother was still asleep upstairs. "May I talk to you?" I asked, and sat down on the floor at his feet. "What's up?" he replied, putting his head close to mine. "I just want to tell you that I love you." I couldn't say it without crying. "I'm sorry for any pain I might have caused you." And he hugged me, and he began to cry too, and he stroked my head and said, "I've always loved you." And we sat like that, crying and holding each other. In a million years, I could not have imagined the bliss I felt in those 5 or 10 minutes. On the day I was flying home out of Shannon Airport, I called my parents in Dublin to say goodbye. My mother answered the phone and said, "Have you seen your father? He hitchhiked it out of here at 5 o'clock this morning." That's when I spotted him running through the airport. He threw his arms around me and he started crying and said, "I just had to see you one more time to tell you how much I love you. I'm afraid I'll die without seeing you again." As far as anyone knows, my father was not ill when we hugged at Shannon Airport, but I never saw him alive again. So the trip to Shannon Airport, it turned out, I got the scoop later on. So we didn't have a car. We never had a car in our family. We really were poor, and not American poor. We were Irish poor, you know. So my father was a senior, so you get free transportation, but at 5 o'clock in the morning, there wouldn't be any buses going, so he would have had to hitch a ride from somebody who had a car to get into town. And even though Limerick and Shannon Airport's only 90 miles away, it's a Herculean task to get there. It's not like you get on a freeway and it's a straight line. It's a big, big deal. So he got on the train. It would have been a free train ride because he had a senior pass. And he got off in Limerick. And apparently he got on some bus. And he told the bus driver, Now, my father was a very charming man. I mean, he was a demon at times, but he had charm to burn, and he had a sense of humour like nobody I know. Anyway, he got on the bus in Limerick. He said to the bus driver, "If I don't get to say goodbye to my daughter at Shannon Airport, you're going to be reading about me in the paper because I'm going to wreck the place." And the bus driver went off his route, and he drove my father from Limerick to the door of Shannon Airport. So I hope there's nobody still waiting for the bus. So when I saw him at the airport, things were kind of in my favor. The whole trip with him went really, really well. So just right after I saw him, they announced that my flight was going to be delayed 45 minutes. So I asked him, "Do you want to go and have a cup of tea?" And he said, "Jesus," he said, "I'd love a pint." So I went and I bought him a pint, and I bought him 2 pints. And I realized then, when I bought him the pints, that I had really accepted that he was just a broken down alcoholic, you know. But he was my father just the same. So it was an enormously gratifying and healing experience that I had with him. And he didn't live to be old. He was only 70 when he died, but he'd abused himself, you know. And his story was that his mother was stepping out with a British soldier. It would have been 1919. It would have been the worst thing that any young Irish girl could have been doing, was going out with a British soldier. So she got pregnant. I mean, the story goes that, you know, her parents or grandparents chased the guy out of the lane, and he was told never to come back. But we don't know what the real story is. But we do know that she went off to Liverpool, and that's where she gave birth to my father. And then she went back to Ireland and said, she'd gotten married when she was in Liverpool, and her husband was going to be following her, and et cetera, et cetera. But of course, there was no sign of any husband. So she kept my father, and she did get married, not to the British guy. She married some Irish guy, and didn't have any children for like 8 years, and didn't think she could conceive. And all of a sudden got pregnant and abandoned my father. So she gave the father over to his granny to raise, but she never recognized him as her son. And we only lived half a mile from her. And I tried to go see her one time. I ran into the guy that she'd married. I recognized him because my mother had pointed him out to me a couple of times, and I was going along Stephen's Green and I saw him, and I had my little sister Veronica with me. She was about 9 at the time. And I saw the guy and I said hello to him, and I said, "Do you know me? Do you know who I am?" And he said, "Oh yeah, aren't you Dr. Murphy's daughter?" And I said, No. I said, "I'm Paddy Jackson's daughter." And he said, oh, he said, "Why don't you come on down to the house?" We were only like 2 blocks away from the house. And I was going to pick up some fish for the dinner, and I said, "Well, I'll go pick up the fish and I'll come on down when I get the fish." And by the time I got there, my grandmother had left. She heard we were coming and she left. So my father read about her death in the newspaper, and he went to her funeral, but he wasn't invited to sit with the family. He was just left out in the cold. So no wonder he was an alcoholic, you know. So that's the understanding you come to when you get mature enough, or you get the kind of help that you need to really put things into perspective. So one Saturday morning, about 6 months after my father and I made our peace, he asked Mammy if she'd like to go into town. "I'd like to buy you something for your birthday, and we can see that Richard Harris film, The Field." "What seldom is wonderful," she replied, and began looking through her wardrobe for something nice to wear. They rode the crowded bus down Thomas Street. As it passed St. John's Lane Church, my father leapt out of his seat and said he wanted to go to confession. "This just surprised, Mammy, because for the most part, the two of them only went to Mass and confession so the neighbours wouldn't gossip about them. You're getting very religious in your old age, my mother needled him. After confession, he said he would rather go for a pint now instead of going to see the film. I'll get you a surprise for your birthday, he told her when she left him at the door of the pub. That night when he got home, he told her, don't bother steeping the corned beef for tomorrow's dinner because I'm going to die tonight. You were well enough to swill down the Arthur Guinness all day, you old hypochondriac, she said to him. And she waited for the retort that never came. He went to bed and she brought him a cup of tea. As she tucked him in, she saw that he was sweating and shivering at the same time. I'm telling you, Rosie, I'm going. I'm sorry I gave you such a hard life. Tell all the kids and the grandkids I loved them. He started to wheeze and rattle, and panic took hold of my mother. And just then the front door opened, and Patrick, the youngest, ran up the stairs and said he'd been at a nightclub and had had a terrible premonition. The 6'5" son picked up the old man like a rag doll and carried him downstairs to where the last embers were fading in the hearth. Virgin Mary, take me, apparently were his last words. He was dead by the time the ambulance arrived. By the time my daughter Ashling and I arrived in Dublin from San Francisco, my father was already laid out and was being waked. Tall tales were being told and tears were being shed, and he just lay there in the coffin as if he were sleeping off a few pints. It was Halloween outside. Rubber tires were being set ablaze, and there were Dracula's werewolves, ghosts, goblins, witches, fairies, and leprechauns abroad. When it was time for the body to be taken up to the nearby church, the men came and manoeuvred the coffin down the narrow staircase. As the family and friends followed the hearse on foot, some kids with sooty faces ran alongside, beating out a rhythm on some dustbin lids. The moon was almost full, and bonfires were blazing. As we passed one of the neighbours' houses, the curtains were slowly drawn back, and two hairy monsters appeared. And we all started howling with laughter. And I thought of how my father could make everybody laugh, especially in sad situations. It was his attempt at relieving their pain. After leaving the coffin at the church, we adjourned to the local pub to continue the wake, and we sang every song ever written. At closing time, we sauntered home in small groups, my mother surrounded by her children and grandchildren. As the church bell tolled midnight, it struck us that it was the 1st of November, our mother's birthday, and we all sang, "Happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you." Your father said he was going to surprise me for my birthday, she said, and we cried and laughed all at once. At the funeral mass the next day, the parish priest mentioned that his father had known my father when they were both young men. He told a story I hadn't heard before. My father had won a singing contest at the Theatre Royal in Dublin when he was in his 20s and was booked for a week of recitals. On opening night, he arrived at the theatre so drunk he couldn't perform. The popular story, according to the parish priest, I don't know if I can trust the parish priest or not, but anyway, the popular story, according to the parish priest, was that my father fell into the orchestra pit. And that was the end of his career, except for the unpaid sessions, dinner dances, and hoolies. So I don't want to drive you to derision. Would you like some more, a song? Would anybody like to come up and sing? I like to imagine that we're just in the kitchen and we're having a cup of tea. That's how I like to operate. I like to be spontaneous. I like to be fresh. And be natural. I don't like to have it all down pat. So if anybody has a request, if they want to do something, if they want to say something, if they want to ask me a question, yeah.